Soft sunlight rose over Hawthorne Ridge, spilling gold across manicured lawns and wrought iron gates. The quiet neighborhood, lined with polished cars and porcelain smiles, was about to be shaken to its core. A black woman stepped toward a silver Rolls-Royce Phantom parked outside a mansion no one believed she could own. Before she even touched the door handle, 3 neighbors had already raised their phones, certain they were witnessing a theft. Police were called almost immediately. Sirens replaced birdsong, and suspicion replaced hospitality. When the officer demanded proof of ownership, the entire street held its breath, waiting for handcuffs. Instead, a folder opened, and every smirking face turned to stone. What happened next would expose more than a crime that had never occurred. It would expose the people who had been so certain it had. Hawthorne Ridge had always prided itself on being exclusive, the kind of neighborhood where hedges were trimmed on schedule and gossip traveled faster than mail. Every resident seemed to know everyone else, their cars, their routines, even their last names, spoken with the reverence reserved for old money and newly earned success. It was a place where wealth was assumed and assumptions were rarely questioned, especially by the people who had lived there the longest. One bright day, a moving truck rumbled down the tree-lined street and stopped in front of the largest house on the block, a stone mansion that had stood empty since its previous owner passed away. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open just enough for curious eyes to peer through. Meredith Langford, president of the Homeowners Association, stood on her porch with a coffee mug in hand, watching the truck with narrowed eyes. A woman stepped out of a black sedan parked behind the truck. She wore simple blue jeans, a crisp white shirt, and flat leather shoes. No jewelry caught the light. No bodyguard trailed behind her. She carried herself with quiet confidence, the kind that did not ask for attention, but did not shrink from it either. Her name was Camille Whitaker, though nothing about her demeanor announced who she was or what she had built. Grant Hollowell, a neighbor 2 houses down, squinted from his driveway and muttered under his breath to no one in particular. "Must be the housekeeper," he said, adjusting his sunglasses as if the sun had suddenly become too bright to bear. Tessa Caldwell, phone already raised, began recording from behind her fence, narrating the scene under her breath like a nature documentary host stumbling upon rare prey. Hawthorne Ridge had exactly 42 homes lining its curved streets. Each was appraised at well over $2 million, each lawn maintained by the same rotating crew of landscapers who arrived on a regular schedule. The neighborhood had its own private security patrol, its own seasonal decoration committee, and its own unspoken hierarchy that placed longtime residents above newcomers. Regardless of what those newcomers had accomplished elsewhere, nobody moved into Hawthorne Ridge quietly. Every sale triggered weeks of speculation about who the buyer might be, what they did for a living, and whether they would fit the unspoken standards the neighborhood had quietly enforced for decades. The empty mansion at the end of the cul-de-sac had been the subject of particular fascination. Its previous owner, a reclusive widower whose passing had left the property in limbo for a long while. Word spread through Hawthorne Ridge faster than the moving truck could finish unloading. Before long, 3 separate group chats had already speculated about the identity of the woman in the white shirt. Some guessed she was hired help preparing the house for a wealthy buyer. Others whispered that she might be a relative of the deceased owner, come to clear out old furniture. Not one person on that street considered the simplest possibility she might be the buyer herself. Meredith crossed her arms as she watched Camille direct movers with calm, precise instructions, her voice never rising, her patience never wavering. "She doesn't belong here," Meredith said quietly to her husband, though she would later insist she meant nothing by it. Grant nodded in agreement, his arms crossed over his chest, his opinion already carved in stone before a single fact had been offered. As the day went on, Camille moved between the truck and the front door with steady purpose, occasionally pausing to check a clipboard she carried, directing the movers toward specific rooms with the confidence of someone who had planned every detail in advance. She thanked each mover individually as boxes were carried inside, offering water from a cooler she had brought along, small gestures that went unnoticed by the neighbors, too busy speculating about her presence to notice her character. At one point, a young mover struggled with a particularly heavy crate near the front steps, and Camille sat down her clipboard to help steady it herself. With her sleeves rolled up, her hands proved as capable as anyone else's on the crew. Meredith watched this too, though she filed it away as nothing more than further proof that Camille must have been hired labor rather than the homeowner herself, an assumption that fit more comfortably alongside everything she already believed. Later, the moving truck pulled away, leaving Camille standing alone in the driveway of her new home. She wiped her hands on a cloth, looked up at the mansion with something like quiet satisfaction, and walked toward the attached garage. The heavy door lifted with a mechanical hum, revealing a space that had clearly been prepared long before the moving truck ever arrived. Sunlight caught the curve of chrome and silver paint, and there, parked in pristine stillness, sat a Rolls-Royce Phantom. Across the street, Tessa lowered her phone just slightly, her eyebrows lifting in something between confusion and disbelief. Grant stepped closer to his window, unwilling to admit what his own eyes were showing him. Meredith said nothing at all, but her jaw tightened, and something unspoken passed through the quiet street like a held breath, waiting to be released. Soon afterward, the neighborhood settled into a deceptive calm, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm no one sees approaching. Camille left early, the Rolls-Royce gliding silently down the street as neighbors peeked from behind curtains, still trying to piece together who she was and how she had arrived among them. She returned later, parking neatly in front of her own driveway, stepping out with the same unhurried grace she had shown during the move. Grant happened to be trimming his hedges nearby, and he paused mid-snip, watching her with narrowed suspicion. "Where does she keep getting that car?" He whispered to his wife loud enough that it carried across the lawn. His wife shrugged, uninterested, but Grant could not let it go, the question gnawing at something deeper than curiosity. Inside her kitchen, Meredith replayed the move again and again in her mind, unable to shake the nagging conviction that something about the new arrival did not add up. She had called 2 other board members earlier, asking casually whether either of them had seen a listing confirmation or a closing notice for the mansion. Neither had, though in truth, neither of them typically saw such paperwork before a sale closed. Still, the absence of confirmation felt to Meredith like evidence in itself. She had lived in Hawthorne Ridge long enough to believe that her instincts about people were rarely wrong, and she trusted that instinct now more than she trusted the calm, unremarkable woman. She had watched Camille unload boxes during the move. Meredith, watching from her window with a cup of tea cooling in her hand, decided she had seen enough. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she rarely used for anything other than noise complaints and stray animal sightings. "Yes, hello, I'd like to report something," she said, her voice steady, almost rehearsed. "There's a woman who keeps showing up with a car that doesn't belong to her. I think she might be stealing it." The words left her mouth with a strange ease, as though suspicion required no evidence, only a feeling. Before long, Tessa had her phone raised again, this time broadcasting live to anyone willing to watch. She lowered her voice with manufactured urgency. "You are not going to believe what is happening on my street right now," she whispered into the camera, angling it toward Camille's driveway. Camille, unaware at first that a small audience had gathered near the edge of her property, unloaded a bag of groceries from the passenger seat, humming quietly to herself as she balanced the bag against her hip. She noticed Meredith watching from across the street and offered a polite wave, a small gesture of neighborly courtesy that went entirely unreturned. Grant stood near his mailbox, pretending to check for mail that had not yet arrived, his eyes fixed firmly on the Rolls-Royce rather than on Camille herself. Tessa's narration grew increasingly breathless, describing every mundane movement as though it carried some hidden significance, transforming a woman carrying groceries into a suspect caught in the act. The stream filled with comments almost instantly. Strangers typed furious speculation from the safety of their own homes. Hundreds of eyes were suddenly fixed on a woman who had done nothing more than park her own car in her own driveway. The audience grew from dozens to hundreds, drawn by the promise of drama unfolding in real time. Officer Nolan Reeves received the call soon afterward, dispatched to investigate a possible vehicle theft in progress. He arrived with the practiced calm of someone who had seen 1,000 false alarms before, stepping out of his patrol car with one hand resting lightly near his belt. Neighbors gathered at a careful distance, phones raised, whispers rippling through the small crowd like electricity through wire. Nolan approached Camille, who stood beside her open car door with an expression of mild, patient confusion. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the vehicle," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Camille complied without protest, stepping back with her hands visible, her composure unshaken despite the growing audience. Not one person in that gathering crowd thought to ask where she lived. Not one person considered that she might belong to the very house behind her. The only question that seemed to matter, the only question anyone cared to ask, was simple and damning in its assumption. "Is this car yours?" Nolan asked, his pen already hovering over his notepad, ready to record an answer he already suspected would be a lie. Camille looked toward her open garage, then back toward the small crowd of familiar strangers who had gathered to watch her humiliation unfold. "It is," she said calmly, without a trace of defensiveness. Nolan nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant nothing had been decided yet. "I'm going to need you to prove that," he said, glancing toward the growing crowd, as if their presence somehow validated the seriousness of the accusation. Tessa's stream ticked past 2,000 viewers, her voice trembling with excitement as she narrated every micro-expression on Camille's face. Meredith stood near the edge of her own lawn, arms crossed, satisfaction written plainly across her features, as though this moment confirmed something she had believed all along. "Could you open the trunk for me as well?" Nolan said, his voice measured but insistent, the request landing like another small stone thrown at a woman already surrounded. Camille exhaled slowly, not from anger, but from the quiet exhaustion of having lived this exact scene before, in different cities, under different skies, with different faces, wearing the same expression of unearned suspicion. She said nothing dramatic. She simply reached for her keys. More neighbors trickled out of their houses as the confrontation continued, drawn by the flashing lights of the patrol car and the murmur of a crowd forming where none usually gathered. A woman named Lorraine, who lived 3 doors down and rarely spoke to anyone, stood at the edge of her lawn with her arms folded, watching with the same suspicious curiosity as everyone else. A teenage boy on a bicycle slowed to a stop, phone raised alongside Tessa's, eager to capture whatever might happen next. The crowd had grown to a sizable group of people before long, an unusually large gathering for a street that typically saw more joggers than pedestrians. Somewhere in the back, someone laughed nervously, the sound quickly swallowed by the tension thick enough to taste. Nolan crouched beside the driver's door, running his fingers along the registration sticker affixed to the windshield, comparing it against something on his radio. Meredith stepped closer, unable to resist inserting herself into the unfolding scene, her voice sharp with manufactured concern. "I've lived here for years," she said loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I would know if someone bought that house." Grant nodded along, arms still crossed, his confidence unwavering, despite having no actual evidence to support it. "There's no way she paid for that car," he said, shaking his head as if the very idea offended some deep personal belief he held about who deserved luxury and who did not. Camille remained standing calmly beside the vehicle throughout this exchange, her hands folded in front of her, her breathing even, betraying none of the frustration she surely felt at being questioned so publicly over something so simple. She glanced briefly at the small crowd, recognizing several faces from during the move, the same faces that had watched her carry boxes without offering a single word of welcome. A younger neighbor near the front of the group looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight and glancing toward the ground, clearly unsettled by the direction the encounter had taken. Nolan noticed this discomfort too, filing it away as he continued his methodical review of the situation, unwilling to let the crowd's certainty influence his own judgment any further than it already had. Tessa's camera zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of expression on Camille's face, feeding a growing audience, hungry for confirmation of their own assumptions. The comments beneath her stream grew uglier as the broadcast continued, with strangers hurling judgments at a woman none of them had ever met. Nolan straightened up, his radio crackling with static as he requested additional information from dispatch. "I'm going to need something more concrete," he said, turning back toward Camille. "Registration alone is not always enough in a situation like this," he said. Camille tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression that held no fear, only quiet calculation. "I'll go get it," she said simply, turning toward her front door without waiting for permission. Laughter rippled through the small crowd almost immediately, the kind reserved for moments when people believed they had already won. "She's not coming back," Grant said with a smirk, nudging his neighbor beside him. "Watch, she'll slip out the back door." Meredith nodded in agreement, already imagining the satisfaction of being proven right in front of everyone. Tessa kept her camera trained on the front door, narrating the tense silence for her growing audience, as though hosting the climax of a reality program. Nolan remained near the car, arms crossed, patient but unconvinced, waiting for a confirmation he still expected would never come. The wait stretched on, tightening the tension across the gathered crowd. Then the front door opened again, and Camille reappeared, walking calmly down the driveway with a slim leather briefcase held firmly in one hand. The laughter died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that settled over the street like a heavy fog. Grant's smirk faltered. Meredith's arms slowly uncrossed. Tessa's camera trembled just slightly as she zoomed in, sensing that the story she had been so eager to broadcast was about to twist in a direction she had not prepared for. Camille opened the briefcase on the hood of the Rolls-Royce, laying out a neat stack of documents with the same unhurried precision she had shown since the moment she arrived in Hawthorne Ridge. The purchase agreement for the vehicle sat on top, followed by a formal certificate of ownership, an insurance record, and a receipt confirming payment in full. Nolan stepped closer, lifting each page carefully, his eyes scanning line after line with growing focus. Every detail matched, every signature aligned, every number on every page told the same undeniable story. A murmur rippled through the crowd as word passed backward from those closest to the car. Whispered translations of what the documents apparently proved, each retelling slightly more astonished than the last. Someone near the back asked aloud whether the police were even allowed to detain someone this long without stronger evidence. The question went unanswered, but lingered uncomfortably in the air. Tessa's viewer count, which had climbed steadily throughout the encounter, suddenly spiked further as the tone of her narration shifted from triumphant certainty to visible uncertainty, her voice losing the confident edge it had carried only minutes before. Grant shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his earlier confidence draining visibly from his expression. "That could be fake," Meredith offered weakly, though even she seemed to hear how hollow the words sounded as they left her mouth. Nolan noted the purchase price listed at the bottom of the vehicle agreement, a figure well into six figures, paid in full some time earlier, according to the transaction date stamped in the corner. The insurance record listed Camille as the sole policyholder with a clean history and no claims filed throughout many years of coverage across multiple vehicles. Nolan compared the signature on the registration with the one on Camille's driver's license. They matched stroke for stroke, curve for curve. He had processed enough fraudulent paperwork over the years to recognize the subtle inconsistencies that usually gave forgeries away. A slightly incorrect font, a mismatched watermark, or a seal that did not sit properly on the page would usually expose a forgery. None of those inconsistencies existed here. Nolan did not respond immediately, still studying the paperwork with careful, practiced attention. He had seen forged documents before, and something in the precision of these papers told him this was not one of those cases. Camille stood quietly beside the hood of her car, her expression unreadable, patient, in a way that unsettled the small crowd more than any outburst could have. "There's more," she said finally, reaching back into the briefcase. Tessa's stream chat exploded with speculation, viewers typing rapid-fire theories about what could possibly come next. Meredith's face had gone pale, though she tried to mask it with a tight, uncertain smile. Grant said nothing at all, his earlier certainty replaced by a creeping, unfamiliar discomfort. From the depths of the briefcase, Camille withdrew a second folder, thicker than the first, bound with a clean elastic band. She placed it gently on the hood beside the vehicle paperwork, her fingers steady, her eyes calm and unblinking. Nolan reached for it without a word, sensing that whatever lay inside would settle this matter permanently. The crowd leaned closer, phone still raised, holding its breath in a strange, shared suspense. Somewhere near the back of the gathering, a voice murmured a question that seemed to hang unanswered in the warm air. What else could there possibly be? Inside was an official, unmistakable certificate of property ownership bearing the seal of the county recorder's office. Nolan opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the address printed at the top, an address that matched the mansion standing directly behind them. Beneath the address, in clear formal print, was a name that silenced every whisper on the street: Camille Whitaker. She was not a tenant, a relative, or hired help preparing the house for someone else's arrival. She was the sole legal owner of the largest home in Hawthorne Ridge, purchased outright without borrowing a single dollar from any bank. Nolan flipped to the next page, his brow furrowing slightly as he confirmed the payment method listed in the record. The full purchase price had been paid in cash through a single recent transfer. No mortgage, no lender, no cosigner standing quietly behind her. Why hadn't the moving process finished sooner? Nolan asked, glancing up from the documents toward Camille's calm, composed face. She met his gaze evenly, her voice steady and unbothered. "I've been having renovations done inside," she said simply, as though explaining something as ordinary as a grocery list. "I wanted everything perfect before I moved in permanently." Lorraine, still watching from the edge of the crowd, leaned toward the teenage boy beside her and whispered something none of the others could quite hear, her expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to shame. The boy lowered his phone slightly, sensing for the first time that what he was recording was not entertainment, but humiliation. Somewhere near the back of the gathering, a woman, who had said nothing throughout the entire encounter, quietly turned and walked back toward her own house, unwilling to watch any further. The crowd that had assembled so eagerly to witness an arrest now seemed unsure where to look, shifting their weight, avoiding one another's eyes as the true shape of the encounter came into focus. Tessa's camera lowered just slightly, her earlier enthusiasm faltering into something closer to disbelief. For a brief moment, she forgot to narrate it all, simply staring at the paperwork spread across the hood of the car. Grant stood frozen near the edge of the driveway, his mouth slightly open. This time, he had no clever remark ready. Meredith's face had drained of color entirely, her earlier certainty collapsing beneath the weight of official documents she could not argue against. Nolan folded the papers carefully, then turned his gaze away from Camille for the first time since he had arrived, letting it settle instead on the woman who had made the original call. "Ms. Langford," Nolan said, his voice noticeably cooler than before. "Why exactly did you report a theft?" Meredith opened her mouth, then closed it again, searching for words that would not come easily. "I just assumed," she began, her voice faltering under the weight of her own explanation. Grant tried to interject, offering something about a misunderstanding, but his words sounded thin against the silence that had settled over the street. Nolan reminded them both calmly but firmly that filing a false report carried legal consequences regardless of how sincere the mistaken belief had been. Tessa's hand trembled slightly as she reached to end her broadcast, but the damage, whatever it would become, had already spread far beyond her control. Nolan closed his notepad and looked around at the dispersing crowd, many of whom were already retreating toward their own houses, suddenly uninterested in lingering at the scene they had been so eager to witness minutes earlier. He turned back to Camille and offered a brief, formal apology on behalf of the department, though even as he said it, the words felt insufficient against what had just unfolded in front of dozens of witnesses. Camille accepted the apology with a small nod, saying nothing further. Her attention had already shifted toward the mansion behind her, as though she had decided to place the confrontation behind her. Grant slipped quietly back into his house without another word. His earlier bravado was nowhere to be found. Meredith remained standing in her driveway long after everyone else had gone inside, staring at the empty street as though searching for someone to blame other than herself. Soon afterward, the recorded stream had traveled well beyond the borders of Hawthorne Ridge, shared and reshared by strangers who had never set foot on that quiet, tree-lined street. A local news outlet soon picked up the story, reaching out to the Homeowners Association for comment on what one producer called a troubling pattern of assumption based on race rather than fact. Meredith declined to answer her phone when the reporter called directly, choosing instead to draft a brief written statement that she deleted 3 times before finally sending anything at all. Grant's business partner forwarded him a link to the footage with a single terse message asking whether this was the kind of judgment he wanted associated with their shared company name. Tessa watched her own comment section fill with criticism she had never experienced before. The tone shifted from admiration for her content to disgust at what she had actually captured. Residents who had not witnessed the confrontation firsthand began messaging one another, some defending their neighbors, others expressing quiet disbelief at what they were seeing. The Homeowners Association inbox filled rapidly with messages demanding answers, some furious, others simply confused about how such a public misunderstanding had been allowed to unfold. Meredith sat rigidly on her porch, phone buzzing incessantly beside her, unable to bring herself to answer a single one of the calls. Grant paced his driveway, muttering justifications to himself that no one else was present to hear. It was into this tense, uncertain quiet that a car pulled up outside Camille's mansion, and a woman in a tailored gray suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase of her own. She introduced herself as Adrienne Mercer, an attorney and longtime business associate of Camille Whitaker, explaining that she had been contacted the moment the incident began circulating online. Adrienne's presence carried a quiet authority, the kind that made Meredith's stomach tighten with a fresh wave of unease. She revealed calmly and without theatrics details about Camille's history that few in the neighborhood had known or bothered to ask about. Camille had grown up in a working-class neighborhood far removed from the polished streets of Hawthorne Ridge, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment afloat. There had been no inheritance waiting for her, no family fortune quietly passed down through generations. Every dollar she now possessed had been built through years of disciplined investment, careful risk, and relentless persistence in an industry that rarely welcomed people who looked like her. Adrienne described how Camille had started small, buying a single rundown duplex when she was young, with savings scraped together from a job at a call center, renovating it herself on weekends before selling it for a modest profit later. That profit had funded a second property, then a third, each success building slowly on the one before it, without shortcuts, without inherited advantage, without anyone handing her a single opportunity she had not earned through relentless work. She had faced rejection from lenders more times than she cared to count, often watching less qualified applicants receive approval simply because they looked like what a lender expected a successful borrower to look like. She had learned over the years to keep her achievements quiet, having discovered that visibility sometimes invited more scrutiny than admiration, especially from people who could not reconcile her success with their own assumptions. Adrienne explained that Camille now held ownership in several commercial developments across the region, though she deliberately kept her name out of public conversation whenever possible. She preferred quiet routines and unremarkable errands over recognition, choosing simplicity, not out of necessity, but out of genuine preference. She just wanted a peaceful place to live, Adrienne said, glancing toward the mansion behind her. Somewhere she could exist without constantly proving herself to strangers. Grant, who had lingered nearby, pretending to check his mailbox again, found himself unable to look away from Adrienne as she spoke, each new detail chipping away at the story he had told himself since the moving truck first arrived. He thought back to his own comment about the housekeeper, spoken so casually, so certain, and felt something close to nausea settle in his stomach. Tessa stood at the edge of the small gathering with her phone finally lowered completely, no longer interested in capturing content, only in absorbing the quiet weight of what Adrienne had revealed. It occurred to her, perhaps for the first time in years, that not every moment needed to be broadcast, that some silences deserved to remain exactly as they were. Meredith's hands trembled slightly as she listened, the full weight of her earlier assumptions settling heavily across her shoulders. Adrienne added, almost as an afterthought, that every moment of the encounter had already been preserved. Copies secured long before anyone in Hawthorne Ridge understood the scale of what they were dealing with. Word of Adrienne's visit spread through the neighborhood almost as quickly as Tessa's original stream had. Soon afterward, Hawthorne Ridge had split cleanly into 2 uneven halves, each responding to the incident in strikingly different ways. Roughly half the residents sent quiet apologies. Some slipped under the door. Others delivered in person with visible embarrassment written across their faces. The other half remained silent, unwilling to acknowledge what had happened, perhaps unwilling to examine what it revealed about themselves. The Homeowners Association called an emergency meeting, its usually calm agenda replaced entirely by a single unavoidable topic. Meredith sat through hours of pointed questions from her own neighbors, her composure fraying with each passing minute. Lorraine, who had watched the entire encounter unfold from her lawn, was among the first to leave a handwritten note in Camille's mailbox, admitting quietly that she had let curiosity curdle into something uglier than she intended. Other residents organized a small dinner. In the period that followed, an informal gathering meant to welcome Camille properly, though she attended only briefly, polite but reserved, unwilling to pretend the earlier humiliation had simply evaporated. A few families quietly defended Meredith in private conversations, insisting that anyone could have made the same mistake given the circumstances, though even they grew quieter whenever the recorded footage was mentioned. The Homeowners Association's usual newsletter, typically filled with landscaping reminders and holiday decoration deadlines, dedicated its entire next issue to a formal statement addressing what had happened. An unprecedented departure from its normally mundane content. Tessa noticed her online following shrinking rapidly. Strangers who once praised her for capturing dramatic content, now condemning her for the role she had played. Grant received a quiet but firm phone call from a business partner, reminding him that public perception mattered in ways he had perhaps never fully considered. Officer Nolan Reeves returned to Hawthorne Ridge later, parking his patrol car in the same spot where the confrontation had first unfolded. He walked up to Camille's front door and knocked, his posture noticeably different from their first encounter. When she opened the door, he offered a sincere apology, admitting plainly that he should have asked more careful questions before assuming guilt. This time, he made a point of saying it loudly enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. Camille listened patiently, her expression softening slightly at his sincerity, though it did not fully erase the exhaustion behind her eyes. "I appreciate that," she said quietly, "but an apology from one person doesn't undo what happened." Nolan nodded, understanding the weight behind her words far better than he had earlier. Behind him, a small cluster of neighbors stood watching, uncertain what to say, unsure whether their presence was welcome or intrusive. Camille looked past Nolan toward them, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "I don't need everyone's apology," she said. "What I need is different." The words hung in the air, heavier than anyone expected, settling over the small crowd like an unspoken challenge. Meredith, standing near the back of the gathering, felt her chest tighten under the weight of an unfinished sentence she somehow already understood. Grant shifted uncomfortably, sensing that whatever came next would demand more than a quiet, private apology. Tessa lowered her phone entirely for once, choosing not to record a moment that felt too significant to reduce into fleeting content. Camille turned slightly, glancing toward the community clubhouse at the end of the street, where the Homeowners Association held its meetings regularly. "I need something to actually change here," she said simply before stepping back inside her home and closing the door behind her. Later, the Homeowners Association clubhouse filled to capacity for the first time in years, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Camille arrived precisely on time, dressed simply, carrying nothing but a single folder tucked beneath her arm. She had never attended one of these meetings before, and her presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere of the room, conversations quieting as she took her seat near the front. Meredith sat rigidly at the head table, her hands folded tightly, avoiding eye contact with most of the room. Grant occupied a seat near the back, arms crossed, though his earlier defiance had visibly softened into something closer to quiet dread. Tessa sat somewhere in the middle rows, phone resting untouched in her lap. Her presence, for once purely personal rather than performative. Before Camille rose to speak, the association's temporary chairperson read through several procedural updates in a voice that seemed to grow smaller with each passing sentence, aware that everyone in the room was waiting for the conversation that truly mattered. A few residents shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs, glancing toward Meredith, then toward Camille, then back down at their own hands, unsure where to direct their attention. Officer Nolan Reeves stood quietly near the back wall, having been invited to attend as a witness to the events, his presence a reminder that this was no longer simply a neighborhood disagreement, but something that had crossed into matters of record and consequence. When the chairperson finally called for open discussion, the room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the old air conditioning unit overhead seemed suddenly uncomfortably loud. When the meeting reached its designated time for open discussion, Camille stood without hesitation, her voice calm and unwavering as she addressed the room. She did not raise her voice, did not point fingers, did not demand apologies from specific individuals seated before her. Instead, she spoke plainly about how quickly assumption could transform an innocent person into a suspect, how easily suspicion could spread faster than truth ever could. She reminded the room that being wrongly accused was not simply an inconvenience, but an experience that carried weight long after the moment itself had passed. The recorded footage from that day played once, silently, projected against the wall for everyone to witness together, undeniable and unedited. No one in the room spoke a single word throughout its entirety. When the footage ended, silence stretched uncomfortably long before Meredith finally rose from her seat, her voice trembling as she addressed the room directly. She admitted that her assumptions had been unfair, that her quick judgment had caused real harm to someone who had done absolutely nothing wrong. She announced with visible difficulty that she would be stepping down from her position as president of the Homeowners Association, effective immediately. Grant stood shortly after, offering a public apology far more sincere than the deflections he had given earlier. Tessa spoke last, her voice quieter than anyone in the room had ever heard it, admitting openly that she had prioritized attention over decency, engagement over empathy. Nolan spoke briefly as well, confirming to the room that the department would be reviewing its own procedures around verifying ownership claims before treating any resident as a suspect based solely on secondhand suspicion. Camille remained standing at the front of the room throughout the remaining discussion, listening without interruption, occasionally nodding when a comment reflected genuine understanding rather than performative guilt. When the meeting finally adjourned, several residents approached her individually, offering handshakes and quiet words of respect that felt markedly different from the curious stares she had received when she first arrived in the neighborhood. She accepted each gesture graciously, though her expression remained carefully measured, unwilling to mistake one moment of accountability for a complete resolution of everything that had happened. The association moved quickly to a vote, unanimously approving new guidelines requiring documented cause before any resident could be publicly accused of wrongdoing on neighborhood platforms. The new Homeowners Association guidelines took effect soon afterward, requiring documented cause and a formal review process before any accusation could be raised against a resident on shared neighborhood channels. Lorraine was elected to fill the vacant board position left by Meredith's resignation, campaigning on little more than a quiet promise to listen more carefully before assuming the worst about anyone. The teenage boy, who had filmed the confrontation from his bicycle, later approached Camille on his own, offering an awkward but sincere apology that she accepted with more warmth than he expected. Slowly, the incident became something residents referenced only in passing, a cautionary story told to newcomers about the danger of judging a neighbor before knowing their name. Peace gradually returned after that meeting, the sharp edges of scandal slowly smoothing into something closer to routine peace across Hawthorne Ridge. Camille completed her renovations and settled fully into the mansion she had purchased outright, her life unfolding with the same quiet rhythm she had always preferred. Neighbors who passed her now offered genuine greetings, small nods of respect earned not through wealth or status, but through the composed grace with which she had handled an injustice that would have broken many others. Officer Nolan Reeves stopped by occasionally, no longer on official business, but simply to check in, a quiet gesture of respect between two people who had shared an uncomfortable, transformative encounter. When able to rebuild her standing among neighbors who no longer trusted her judgment, Meredith moved away not long afterward. Grant remained, though he made a visible effort afterward, greeting Camille warmly each time their paths crossed on the quiet street they now shared. Tessa eventually returned to her platform, though her tone had shifted considerably from the eager theatrics of before. She posted a single, quiet acknowledgement of what had happened, admitting her role without excuses, offering no attempt to reshape the narrative in her own favor. Much later, on a calm day, Camille stepped into her Rolls-Royce Phantom and pulled slowly out of her driveway, the engine barely making a sound against the quiet street. No phones rose to record her this time. No suspicious whispers followed her down the road. Neighbors simply watched from their porches in silence as she passed, no longer questioning who she was or whether she belonged among them. Prejudice, it turned out, could accuse someone in mere seconds, built on nothing more than a glance and an assumption. But once truth was established through patience and unwavering evidence, it had the power to dismantle that accusation completely and leave it in ruins forever.